Hello, my name is Linda Huber, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan School of Information. In this presentation, I'll be sharing findings from our research about the experiences of therapists doing remote gig work for telehealth platforms. The full paper is titled An Approximation of Freedom, On-Demand Therapy and the Feminization of Labor. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge my two co-authors on this paper, Silvia Lindtner and Casey Pierce, also at the University of Michigan School of Information. The findings I'm going to discuss today come from interviews with 25 therapists based in the United States, working full or part-time for some of the telehealth apps and websites you see on this slide. We were additionally informed by a discourse analysis of some of these platforms' marketing materials and mental health professional communities online. The main finding that emerged from this research pointed us not so much towards the impact of teletherapy platforms themselves, but really the pre-existing context of devaluation and feminization that these teletherapy platforms were entering into, and the way that they sort of appeared to offer freedom from some of those conditions. In our interviews, we've heard time and time again about therapists' incredible struggle to break into this career and find sustainable, supportive work environments. In particular, therapists describe the difficulty of working in community mental health settings, or what's called agency work, which are often the first place that a therapist works during or after their graduate training. In these settings, therapists are often working with high needs or high risk clients, as they are called, including in prison reentry programs, working with abused or battered women, and unhoused or uninsured populations. These two quotes here deal specifically with therapists' experiences in these community mental health and or agency settings, pointing to pervasive experiences of burnout, unsustainable caseloads, and the overload of both emotional and bureaucratic labor. In our interviews, many therapists used phrases like being in the trenches for working in these kinds of settings. We should be careful to emphasize that the difficulty of work in these settings isn't just natural. It's something produced through processes of feminization and the general devaluation of this kind of work. Like most forms of care work, therapy is a highly gendered profession. Nearly 80% of therapists in the US are women. But feminization is a term that refers not only to the gender makeup of an occupation, but the way that that work is really structured and devalued, illustrated a bit by this quote from Donna Haraway. In her 1993 book, sociologist Eileen Phillipson traces the history of feminization of the profession following World War II. She concludes that the female psychotherapist of the 21st century will share more occupationally with a wage worker than with her professional counterpart in the mid-20th century. And this is really the context that we discovered in our work and in these interviews. And so some of the specific ways that we saw feminization playing out in the mental health profession in these interviews included a really intensive bureaucratic control over work, lack of support for emotional labor, including the work that happens internally after you leave the office, and balancing at-home reproductive labor, disproportionate responsibilities of childcare, elder care among these workers. In the therapy profession, one kind of individual escape hatch from these really unsustainable feminized working conditions is to start a private practice. But starting your own private practice is very difficult, capital and time intensive. And instead, therapists describe turning to telehealth platforms as a kind of workaround to the workaround, a more accessible, if more devalued way to escape from unsustainable conditions in community mental health and agency work. That said, we argue that this is really a stopgap solution because it's an individualized workaround that leaves the basic conditions of feminization in place for most workers in most instances. And furthermore, because these platforms actually don't eliminate feminized working conditions, they just reproduce them in new ways. And this is why we titled the paper An Approximation of Freedom, because these platforms are not a true escape, but a kind of individual workaround for unsustainable working conditions that nonetheless reproduces devalued and feminized working conditions in new ways. So one example of how this manifests in the platform setting is through the invisibilization of what STS scholar Beth Semmel describes as paracare, the forms of work that go into caring for someone, but are invisibilized or devalued compared to the real delivery of care, or in this case, the actual therapeutic moment. So in particular, while these platforms employ automated screening processes to try to filter out some of the complex or high-risk cases, these automated processes are deeply flawed, especially because mental health is constantly fluctuating. It's not a clear-cut category that people fit neatly into. And so therapists who have no real front desk or admin team supporting them become the actual human labor responsible for this kind of unpaid, invisible work of screening people out of the platform if they're not appropriate for it, doing referral work, getting people in touch with local crisis care and things like that. Another example of the feminization of therapy work within the context of platforms is through the use of on-demand text messaging therapy. So several direct-to-consumer platforms emphasize texting as the main modality and kind of the main selling point, as you see in this ad here. These apps require therapists to respond within a certain time frame or risk having their account frozen. And they also use a pay-by-word mechanism that incentivizes volume and frequency of exchange over other kinds of therapeutic goals. The platform's technical structures and marketing materials encourage a kind of on-demand availability that feels more like texting your friend, as this therapist here describes it, and less like a professional service relationship. This is a really powerful example of shifting therapy to a more gendered, devalued form of emotional support labor. So to quickly summarize, teletherapy platforms can appear as an approximation of freedom from feminized, devalued work, while simultaneously reproducing the same logics of feminization in order to make care scalable. In the discussion section of the paper, we suggest that the platform seems to have a similar function for clients or the patients using these platforms, and that the platforms seem to provide a more accessible form of care for some individuals in some instances, while nonetheless replicating and reinforcing the kind of deeply inaccessible, inequitable structure of mental health care delivery that we have in the United States. This case study evokes the image of platforms as a kind of band-aid for infrastructural failure and point towards the need for more systemic redress to issues of feminization and devaluation of mental health work and our inaccessible and under-supported mental health structures. Thank you for your time, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.